Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon, and on this week's episode, we wanted to take a brief step out of the familiar pattern and bring you something very special. If you're a regular listener to the program, first of all, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being out there and taking us in. And second of all, the name Richard Oxenberg will probably be quite familiar to you. Jerry and Richard teamed up for our very popular series, Two Philosophers Wrestle with God. You can find the audio version right here on this podcast or the book version on Amazon.com. On today's episode, Richard tells us his spiritual story, which is both heartbreaking and illuminating, and ultimately a story of hope, love, and a God who is always in pursuit of our whole heart. Here's Jerry to begin the conversation. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Thank you, Richard Oxenberg, for joining me and your willingness to tell your spiritual story. Most people's stories start, of course, in childhood, and the kind of religious story, if you frame it that way, starts with were you raised in a religion? And what were your parents like? Were they religious or spiritual or seekers or finders?
Yeah. Well, so I was raised in I guess what you generally call a secular Jewish family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Yes, they're very common.
But yeah, so my parents were not particularly religious or observant, but we identified, of course, as Jews. We belonged to the local Reform temple. We celebrated Passover every year. And on Yom Kippur, we would generally make a presence in the temple. We would show up for, Yom Kippur can go on for long periods of time. We would not, but we generally tried to make some sort of appearance there. My grandparents, especially on my mother's side, were Orthodox Jews. So,
Really?
yeah. So my parents were sort of straying away from that. And I do remember as a young child, my mother buying me this big golden book Bible, and with all these very colored pictures of Joseph in his many colored coats, and
yes, those are wonderful.
right, Adam and Eve with their sort of skins, fur, draping their bodies. So I remember that. And I remember enjoying that, enjoying reading. I don't think in those days I asked myself whether the stories were true or not true. That question didn't even occur to me.
Yeah.
And then, just to go into it, if we're going to get into the story, really, my story kind of begins with a traumatic event that occurred in my childhood. When I was 8 years old, my 7-year-old sister was hit by a car right in front of me. I was on the sidewalk, and she was hit by a car and killed.
Right before your eyes.
Yeah, I do not have a recollection of seeing the impact. So I don't know, I may have been looking away or something. But what I still have a very vivid memory of is standing over her body in the street.
Oh, geez.
And watching, there was blood gushing out of her nose, which I remember thinking, I didn't think people bled that way. And screaming, and I screamed. I've often remembered that to be the most spontaneous thing that I've ever done.
It just came out.
It just came out. It's like I was aware of the scream after I began screaming. And then that was quite, so she was killed. I remember going that night. It was a Friday evening. And so the street got crowded with people looking at the scene. The fire trucks came. I don't know what the fire trucks were intending to do. But they shut the street down, and I spent the night sort of wandering up and down the street. Um, um, and I remember at one point I went into my backyard and prayed to God. I offered to sacrifice all my toys if he would let my sister live. But he didn't take me up on the offer. I guess he had all the toys he needed. And so yeah, so it was quite a shaking event, both from a religious point of view, but also just from a life point of view. Trying to understand what this life is all about, and sort of all of a sudden you feel like the guardrails are off. Anything can happen, and anything might happen. Especially with this, it was so sudden. It was, we were out playing together, one moment, and the next moment she's dead. And the reason this is really very much a part of my story is because the question at that point for me was, who's in charge here? And,
yes.
And what could this, if there's a God in charge, what's he doing and why is he doing it? And so it was it just shook my whole sense of what was true and false, good and bad. I remember sitting at Passover ceremonies after that for the next number of years. We still had Passover. And, Passover Seder is all about how God liberates the Israelite slaves from Egypt with a great suite of miracles and signs and wonders and so forth. And I would just sit there saying to myself, really? I mean,
Yes.
Has anybody really noticed what's going on around here? It just seemed like this massive cover-up. At one point in the Passover Seder, there's you read this thing about how God is, and then you almost have to get a thesaurus, to praise. You praise God in all these ways. He's magnificent. He's merciful. He's kind. He's compassionate. He's all-seeing. He's all-knowing. It just goes on and on. And I'm just sitting there saying, well, where was he?
Yeah.
Right? Where was he on that night? And how can we be reading all of this without asking this question? Ultimately, I think what that led me to was, I think Stendhal, the French novelist Stendhal, I later learned many years later, is reputed to have quipped, God's only excuse is that he doesn't exist. There's some, I think there's some spiritual truth in a sense to that, because if God does exist and God is allowing and could prevent all these horrors, and of course, I became aware that this was not the only horrible thing that ever happened to anyone. If God does exist and can prevent all these horrors and just doesn't, then that, doesn't make for a very positive idea of God. And so one of the questions I guess you can ask is it better, even from a spiritual point of view, to believe in a cruel God or no God at all? I mean, which is going to make the heart more at peace? And I think the answer to that one is no God at all is better than a cruel God. I think that's what I finally concluded, that there wasn't a whole lot of evidence for God. God never knocked on my door and said anything to me. I know you've had some experiences. And so I gave up. So I decided I was an atheist, and that was the most reasonable thing to be. And now, in retrospect, and also even at the time, even though I guess atheist, no God at all is better than a cruel God, it's still not what you actually want, right? It doesn't actually satisfy one's spiritual longing. And I still had this great deal of spiritual longing within me, that just had nowhere to go. And so that, for me, began really a long period of searching of, what could possibly satisfy this longing. Fast forward a little bit to, I think it was my early days as an undergraduate. I'm still looking for something, and I was visiting a friend who was a student at SUNY Binghamton, and he was renting out a house for the summer, and he invited me to stay for a couple of weeks. And on the shelf of his house, it wasn't his book, it was the book of whoever he was renting the house from, was a copy of Philip Kaplow's The Three Pillars of Zen. And I pulled it out and started reading it, and I just became mesmerized with it. I remember I read it through. It's like a 500-page book. I read it through in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. And what captured me about it was the idea that there was some supernal state of mind that you could arrive at that would allow you to be at peace with the nature of existence, right? It wasn't a God in the sense of a person, but it was God in the sense of some sort of ultimate state of realization that would reconcile you to life. And that really intrigued me. And so I started at that point reading a lot of books on Eastern religions. D.T. Suzuki, his essays on Zen, and of course Alan Watts at that time was very popular as a popularizer of Eastern religion. And I tried meditation, not very successfully, because I just found meditation boring. And I think that was the principal problem. I would sit there and say, okay, I'm waiting for something to happen here. And nothing much ever happened. And it just sort of made me foggy-headed. I mean, that's kind of
that's not good. It's supposed to be the opposite. That's not what it was
supposed to do. It made me foggy-headed, and one of my legs would often fall asleep.
Yeah.
Remember one time I went to a Zen center, and I was sitting there at the Zen center, and my right leg had fallen asleep, and my head is feeling foggy-headed, and we then get up and do the sort of walk around meditation, but I couldn't quite walk around because one of my legs was totally numb. So anyway, it didn't seem to be
life's
leading.
Moments.
It didn't seem to be leading to enlightenment. So I gave up on that, more or less. And I guess the next big moment for me that sort of pushed me forward was, again, as an undergraduate, I decided to take an intro to philosophy class, but it was closed out. And so they steered me into a class called 20th century theologians. And in that class, we were assigned the book, The Dynamics of Faith by Paul Tillich. And I ended up, I mean, I think I read it, the first time I read it, I think it kind of went over my head. But sometime later, I read it again. And once again, I was mesmerized by a book because what Tillich was saying, as I came to understand it, the dynamics of faith is all about how religion expresses itself through symbol and metaphor and myth. And that you have to sort of, I think Tillich speaks of it as breaking the myth, to see through the mythological surface of it to the inner, deeper truth that it's trying to express. And I suddenly I came to the, I don't know if I say came to the realization, or it occurred to me that this was a way of reading the Bible. I mean, well, Tillich was saying that, but that by reading the Bible in this way, I could understand the Bible to be saying something very similar to what the Eastern religions were saying. That the God of the Bible, who was represented in the Bible as this sort of austere person who tended to command people of things, and when Job complained to him, he sort of berated him. That if you read it mythologically, if you read it symbolically, at least I could see this God figure in the Bible as, in some sense, representing this ultimate state of being, what Tillich called the ground of being, right? This ultimate state of being that if you could somehow get in touch with, would be salutary, would be spiritually fulfilling and satisfying and bring you to peace. And so that then opened me up to having a much more favorable view of Western religion. So instead of seeing God, the God of Western religion, as just this sort of overweening authority figure who's a little bit full of himself, I began to see that, well, this is just a way of expressing this deeper truth. And I think that's the point at which I started saying, well, maybe I'll call myself an agnostic from now on, rather than an atheist.
An agnostic is someone who just doesn't come down on either side.
Well, the thing is that that I had this deep longing for some sort of spiritual connection that was unfulfilled. It was unfulfilled. And even, so reading books about Zen and reading books later on about Hinduism and Brahman and so forth, and reading Tillich, and I eventually went on to read most of Tillich. It was fascinating to me at an intellectual level, and it was compelling to me at an intellectual level. I couldn't put it down in a way, but it didn't penetrate. It didn't get me to that place of feeling that I was spiritually connected to anything. It was
that's fascinating, Richard. Just having a big intellectual explanation doesn't necessarily do it.
Yeah, what I've come to realize about my whole intellectual life, in many ways, is that the intellect, for me, is a little like sight, in the sense that you can see something that is way down the road, but you're not there yet.
Okay.
Right? I mean, you can see it, but that doesn't mean that you're there. The fact that you see it. So I could see it as a possibility. I could see God and, as a possibility, but it wasn't a possibility that I was at. and I didn't really know how to get to it. If I went to a synagogue service or a church service, at this point, because Tillich, of course, is a Christian theologian, so I started thinking in terms of Christian ideas. If I went to a church service or a synagogue service, it just didn't do anything for me. It once again, I just sat there feeling kind of bored. Well, the next thing that happened, just to continue the story, is I got a BA in psychology, but didn't pursue that. I ended up going and getting a 4-month certificate in computer programming and got a job as a software developer and started working for a company in New York. I grew up in New York, that then moved to Atlanta, Georgia. And so I moved with them to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, I started attending a Unitarian church, basically just for the social interaction. And at the church, I had a conversation with the minister and told the minister about my interest in Tillich's theology. And she suggested that I put together a lecture course on Tillich's theology and present it to people at the church. So I did. I put together a little lecture course, and we did a little class at the Unitarian Church on Tillich's theology, and it went over nicely. And I was then invited to give the same lecture course at some other churches in Atlanta, at Presbyterian Church, and then at an Episcopalian church. And I used to joke to myself, here I am, a Jewish atheist teaching Christian theology and Christian Sunday schools. It was
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I did that, and then I had a friend who was I worked with at my software company, who was a devotee of Sri Aurobindo, the Hindu sage Sri Aurobindo. He would go, my friend would go every year to Pondicherry, India, where there's an Aurobindo ashram, and do a retreat with Aurobindo. Not with Aurobindo. Aurobindo is no longer with us in body, as he once corrected me.
But he is a 20th century thinker.
He's a 20th century
sage or whatever.
Right. And anyway, I used to get into these long conversations with my friend about Aurobindo's ideas. And he suggested that I read this. Aurobindo had this big tome called The Life Divine. It's about 1,100 pages. And I read that with great fascination.
Amazing.
Yeah, because I was just searching. I couldn't put down the search. And finally, after reading that, I said to myself, I should do something. Rather than just read books and think about it, maybe I should do something. And so I decided that I would once again try some sort of meditational practice. And I want to do a yoga kind of meditational practice because I couldn't find an Aurobindo group, but I was looking for some group that did yogic meditation in Atlanta, and I found one. And I started attending in a very haphazard way because that's the way I tended to do things. I didn't do it in the disciplined way that I was supposed to. And then it took me a little while to realize that they were connected to a larger network of people who were followers of this Indian guru. This was during the summer, I think this was the summer of 1994. And the preceptor of my group said that this guru was coming to town. They had an ashram in Molena, Georgia, which was about an hour south of Atlanta. And the guru was going to come to town and run a retreat over the Labor Day weekend at this ashram. And he encouraged me to attend. And I thought, well, great, it would be interesting to see this enlightened guru, and so I was sort of excited about it. And I went to the ashram. They were renting out tents. They had tents. You could rent them out for like $5 a day for people who were participating in the retreat. And once again, I did some meditation. Oh, and they talked. Now, here's where this whole story starts to get a little strange. This group talked about how the master was able to transmit energy to the people who were meditating. I didn't believe it. I still had my very materialist Western metaphysics, so, okay, you feel like that, but that's okay. But nevertheless, maybe there's something that I could gain from doing the meditation. So I went to the ashram, and on the second evening of the ashram, the master was giving a talk. And I really wanted to get in and hear his talk because I wanted to see what an enlightened person would look like. And I sort of wedged myself into this crowded room. And at the end of his talk, there was a question and answer session. And I raised my hand. I think this falls under the category of the fools who rush in where angels fear to tread. And I asked him, because he was talking a great deal about love. And one of the things that I had felt in this meditation group that I'd been attending was that there wasn't a lot of interpersonal reaction going on. People would come, they'd talk a little bit to one another, they'd meditate, and then they'd sort of disperse. And it was very impersonal. And so I asked him, he was talking about love, and I said, you talk a lot about love and about the self. And I take it when you speak of the self, you don't mean the personal self, right? The ego. And he said, oh, no, the self is eternal. And I said, well, the reason I ask is because you're talking a lot about love. So when you say love, do you mean something personal or something impersonal? And he says, oh, impersonal. And I said, well, can love be impersonal? And he said, oh, the other is just attachment. And then what happened is that our eyes locked, and I felt this, I don't even know how to describe it, this sort of beam of energy pound me in the chest. I mean, it was not subtle. It was not at all subtle. It was like being hit, like being slapped in the chest by someone. Totally unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. And the session ended, and I went out. I went back to my tent. It was night, and it was as if there was this globe of white energy in my chest region, radiating throughout my body. It was really remarkable, and I'm thinking, well, okay, it didn't feel bad. Maybe maybe I'm about to become enlightened.
Yes.
I've gone through all these years looking to be enlightened. Maybe this is going to be it. And I didn't get any sleep that night. And the next morning, I went they had this big meditation tent where everybody came to meditate. So I went to the morning meditation. And now I was meditating, and it was not boring anymore. I felt like there was a sense I was hovering above my body in a state of what I would call bliss. And that was quite wonderful. And I thought, I'm at least, couldn't be more than 2 or 3 seconds from enlightenment. And
you're really getting close.
Yeah, I got to be right at the cusp, And then I felt this energy starting to concentrate in my forehead, in what I think in Hinduism they call the third eye. And And it was as if I was being asked whether I wanted it to be opened or not. And I said, well, sure, I'm about to be enlightened. And I did feel this opening in my forehead. And then I felt this intense inrush of energy that absolutely terrified me. I mean, the reaction was no longer fun. Now I was terrified because this was too much. It was completely overwhelming. It was not blissful or peaceful energy. It was energy, and like electric kind of energy. And I had my eyes closed, and I began under my eyelids, I began seeing these weird faces, and it was just terrifying. So I stopped the meditation. I began to think, oh my God, what is going on here? Who is this master? What is he doing? I ended up wandering around the ashram for most of the day, trying to figure out what was going on. I ran into my preceptor, and he was busy with other people, couldn't talk to me. And at one point, I ran into the master again. Now, the master was not easy to talk to because whenever he'd be on the grounds, he'd be surrounded by a great throng of people. So you couldn't get close to him. But as it happened, he and his throng were walking down one side of a building, and I was walking down the other side of the building, and we met at the corner. And there I was. Okay. Yeah, there I was, right in front of him. So I said, Master, can I ask you a question? And he said, certainly. And then I didn't know what to say, because what I wanted to ask him was about, what was going on with me. But we were surrounded by this throng of people, and I didn't, I was embarrassed to, So I said, well, I've been having these very intense meditations, is the way that I put it. And he said, well, that's what we're here for. And I just, because people had talked about him as if he could just look at you and see your spiritual state. So I was just waiting for him to see what was going on with me. But apparently he didn't. Or in any event, I said, yeah, I know that's what we're here for. But, and then he said, real life is when you don't know you're living it. Which, to this day, I'm not sure what he meant exactly by that. But it wasn't comforting because I had always wanted to know that I was living my life, Right. Yes. I mean, it was people who didn't know they were living their life. That I would have defined that as real death, not real life. So I said, I don't know what that means. And he said, well, think about it. And then he sort of walked away. So all this was incredibly disturbing. And I finally decided that I had to leave the ashram. And I did. And I was still feeling this energy going through my body. From my reading of Tillich and from other things, from watching It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street and going to sit on Santa Claus's lap. My mother, even though we were Jewish, she used to take me to sit on Santa Claus's lap on Christmas time. So I had these positive associations with Christianity and with Jesus. And years ago, a friend of mine in Atlanta had introduced me to this chapel in Atlanta where there was a Catholic chapel where there was a 24-hour adoration of the Holy Host. Then I don't know if you're familiar with that sort of thing, but it was Christ the King Church on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. I'm sure it's still there. And they had, I don't know if they still have this, they had a little chapel, and it was open 24 hours a day, and they always had somebody manning it. And you could go there and pray. They had a consecrated wafer, which was the Holy Host, and you could sort of kneel before the consecrated wafer and pray, and any time of the day or night. And so when I got back from the ashram, and I was feeling like I was being accosted by something evil, in my mind, that's what I was feeling. So I wanted something good. You need something good to counteract something evil. And somehow in my mind, Jesus was good. So I went to this chapel and I started praying there. And even there, I started feeling a sort of energy sort of emanating from, I mean, it was very weird. I never felt anything quite like this, anything like this in my life. But I had a sense of comfort there. I remember there was a bas relief of Jesus being baptized, and he had such a wonderfully peaceful expression on his face. And I just kept thinking, that's what I want, you know.
Yes, yes.
Not all this energy, you know. I left that. Meanwhile, I still hadn't gotten any sleep for like now a couple of days. I called my friend Monzer, and who was in the religious studies program at the University of Georgia at that time, and started talking to him about some of the stuff that had been going on. He and I had many conversations about religious philosophy over the years. And at that point, I decided I needed to be baptized.
Oh, really? At that point?
That somehow that would be a kind of protection against whatever was going on. And so I asked him, he had a priest, Monzer had somebody who he admired was a priest. And Monzer gave me his name, and I called the priest up. And he talked to me a little while and probably said, to himself, I don't know. He advised me to go to this monastery in Conyers, Georgia. The monastery, I believe, is still there. It's a Cistercian monastery. And he said that there are probably some monks there who would be familiar with mystical experiences. And maybe somebody there could help you because, just sort of over my head. So that's what I did. I drove up with my friend Monzer. I drove up to the monastery in Conyers. And the first person I ran into there was a nun. And I ended up spending most of the day with her. We walked around the grounds. I'd been to the monastery before. An ex-girlfriend of mine had introduced me to it years ago. And I used to go up there and I just sit in the grounds and read a book because it was incredibly peaceful. They had a gate that led into the monastery, and it was, I remember you'd walk through the gate and it's like the whole atmosphere would change, right? From a ordinary atmosphere, suddenly you'd be in this place of peace. Anyway, the nun and I wandered around. I started telling my whole story about my sister's death and my struggles with God and with religion. And remember, she said to me, Richard, God has been chasing you like a hound.
Yes.
I said, well, I hope he finds me, and she said there is a monk that she would like, to see if he will see me because he has some experience with mystical kinds of things. And so she led me and Monzer into the guest house of the monastery, went off to find the monk. And a little later, not long after that, this monk walked in named Pablo Maria. And he had this wonderfully kind face. and a Spanish man, and he walked in and he took my hand and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Calm down, it's going to be all right." And it was, his whole demeanor was incredibly calming. And I said to him, "I'd like to be baptized." And he said, "Well, we can't do that. You have to, apparently in the Catholic Church, you have to go through a period of religious education, Catholic education, before they'll baptize you." So I wasn't eligible to be baptized. But he said, "Would you like to receive the Holy Spirit?" And I said, "Well, sure." Who wouldn't want to receive the Holy Spirit? And so he did. He said a prayer. He was holding my hand. And at the conclusion of the prayer, I felt this wave of vibratory energy pass from his hand into mine and then go through my body in 3 successive waves. But this now I thought was good energy.
Yes, it feels different, right?
It felt different and it felt good. And now I figured that good energy is going to tackle the bad energy or whatever. All of this, you have to understand, Jerry, that I didn't believe that any of this was possible. So it was completely startling and upending of my basic conception of reality, energy passing between people. But afterwards, he gave me this big hug and said to me, "There's no evil in you, Richard," which was very comforting. Yeah. There's no evil in you. Whatever it is you're going through, it's not, And then he said he was going to go in and I guess it was time for Mass. And he was going to say a Mass for me. And to this day, I still don't know. I need to go talk to some Catholic person to understand what that means. I don't know what it means to say a Mass for somebody. But he went in and he did the Mass, and then he came out and he gave me another big hug. And he said he got a message for me. And the message was that God was already within me and working within me. And so that was
amazing.
That was a nice message.
Yes, and it sounds like a truthful message. I would say, from my perspective, it sounds like a truthful message.
I think it's probably true for all of us, but maybe at different times we come to moments of crisis where it becomes more true or more relevantly true. I stayed the night at the monastery. He gave me permission to stay overnight in the guest house. And but the energy was still going on. And at this point, I was intellectually, I've always had a philosophical bent. And so intellectually, I'm totally confused right now. I don't know what's true. I don't know up from down or right from wrong or evil from good. I don't know what is going on. There's some things feel good, some things don't feel good, but I don't know. Was the master at the ashram, was he a bad guy or was he a good guy who was with this energy, bad energy? Was it good energy? Was the energy I felt at the ashram the same as the energy I felt at the monastery? Who knew, right? And there was nobody there to explain it to me. I went home and I would go through these moments of thinking that, well, okay, things are going to be great. And who knows, maybe I won't be enlightened. Maybe I'll, I don't know, have some sort of, westernized or Christianized version of something. But I would go through these ups and downs of experience. And I got home and I was still feeling all this energy coming through me. And somehow I got it into my mind that if the energy hit my heart, that I might have a heart attack.
Yeah.
And I called my ex-girlfriend And asked her, she's a sweetheart. She's still a very good friend of mine. And told her sort of a little bit of what was going on and asked her if she would drive me to the emergency room. She drove me to the emergency room. I said, maybe I'm having a heart attack. They wheeled me in. They did an EKG. Nothing was wrong with my heart. And I said once again that I wanted to be baptized. And this time, they had a Methodist minister who was the chaplain in the hospital. And he didn't have any scruples about baptizing me. And so he came in and he baptized me, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And he took some baptismal water and tapped my forehead. He tapped it right in this area that had been opened. And once again, I started feeling this vibratory energy going through me. My friend Vicky, who was there, said that my face went from a state of fear to a state of peace. And it sort of stayed that way for about half an hour. And so I was baptized. And the story goes on. I won't go through all the details of it because it could go through a long story. I spent years after that trying to sort through what was going on intellectually. At some point, I had been taking night classes at Georgia State University in philosophy, just out of my own interest. And at some point in the middle of all this, a woman who I knew from Georgia State called me up and asked me for coffee. And we went and had coffee. And she said that she was applying to the graduate program in women's studies at Emory University. And she said, I happen to have an extra application, Richard. Why don't you apply for the philosophy program? And I said, well, I'm not going to get into the philosophy program. And she said, go ahead, why don't you apply? What do you have to lose? So she handed me the extra application. And I went home, and I was also still going through tremendous anxiety over everything. And really, in order to distract my mind from all the anxiety, I decided to fill out the application. And I did. I filled it out. I went to Georgia State and got some recommendations from some of the professors that I'd been taking these classes with. And they gave me some nice recommendations. And lo and behold, I got admitted to Emory University into the PhD program. And I started attending. I worked out an arrangement with my software company that would allow me to work part-time there while I was getting my PhD. At some point, I met a woman, just tell it very quickly now, I know it's going on and on, from an evangelical church. She was in the theology program at Emory, and she invited me to attend a play that they were doing at her evangelical church. They were doing a production of Edward Albee's The Zoo Story, which is just not the sort of play you would expect to find at an evangelical church. But afterwards, I spoke to the pastor who was very involved in the theater community in Atlanta and asked him about it. And he said, well, his belief was that that Christianity should be responding to the existential ills, the existential despair of people. And so therefore these plays that illustrated these existential ills were highly relevant to Christianity. And I was very impressed with that. And I started attending that church. And I eventually got my PhD. I got a job, never a tenure track job, but a job teaching at Boston University in their core curriculum program. I moved up to Boston and have since been writing a lot of, and I guess, to sort of wrap this up, at this point, I would say that I have arrived at what I would call faith. And I've sort of given up on the idea of having this explosive enlightenment experience. In effect, that's not what being connected to God is ultimately about. It's about feeling a sense of being able to trust that existence is ultimately benign and ultimately loving in some sense. And to me, faith is having that trust, is experiencing that sense of trust at a deep level. And Jerry, it took me, we could do a whole other session, I guess, on my intellectual musings. It took me a lot of intellectual wrestling to come up with a story about God that I could tell myself that would allow for the horrors that occur, like my sister's death, without negating the ultimate goodness of reality and being. And I guess I have finally arrived at that for myself. And I've come to a place, the journey continues. It's never completely completed. But I've come to a place of peace, basic sense of peace, a sense of being connected with the eternal. I think the way that it ultimately has to work, and I think you find this in virtually all the religions, is that there is that part of us that is connected to the ups and downs of this world, what in the Eastern religions is called samsara. And samsara is always up and down, right? You win some, you lose some, and samsara is, you can't be truly at peace in samsara, because samsara is always taking away with one hand what it gives with the other. But underneath samsara is, you can think of it as the metaphor being like the ocean. On the surface of the ocean are all these waves, and the waves are crashing against each other and knocking against each other. But if you go down beneath the waves, you get to a place of stillness and a place of peace, where the ocean is at peace. And that's what I've come to believe and experience in some ways. That, on the surface, there's life and death and good and bad and love relationships and the breakup of love relationships. And it's like the surface of the waves. But down below that, there is the ground of being, to use Tillich's phrase, is peace, is a state of peace, a state of belonging, a state of embrace in some sense. And if you can somehow connect to that place, right? To me, that's what faith is. Faith is experiencing, maybe it's at one level it's just believing in, but ultimately fulfilled faith is the experience of that place. And it's not going to stop you from getting sick, and it's not going to stop you from dying, and it's not going to stop you from having loved ones that die. But it is going to make all those things penultimate rather than ultimate. And so there is an ultimate peace that underlies all of that. And that ultimate peace expressed outward, right? Expressed inwardly, it's a state of peace. Expressed outwardly, it's a state of love and compassion for others, the desire that there be peace for others. And then that turns into a desire for justice in the world and such things as that. And And I guess that's where I've come to today.
A wonderfully engaged life. And the phrase that came to my mind as you were concluding was that, I guess, Christian phrase, the peace that passeth understanding.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the peace that passeth understanding.
Absolutely. And that's a phrase that I've often appealed to or thought about in exactly the sense in which I was talking, that the reason it passes understanding is because it's not contingent on what's happening in the world, right? There's all sorts of, we generally think that to be at peace, everything has to be going well for you in the world. But the peace that passes understanding is the peace that comes from something more deep, something more fundamental than the ups and downs of the world. I want to just add one other thing.
Please.
I was baptized. So I've baptized. I do go to church every now and then, although I still sometimes find the service is boring. But what I do love in going to church is taking communion. The ritual of communion has always been deeply meaningful to me because it's a sense of ingesting the divine within you. And there's something very beautiful to me about that. I still regard myself as Jewish. I've never felt that in becoming baptized, I was converting away from Judaism. I just was, it was like, it's like that line that you're not losing a daughter, you're gaining a son. It was, I wasn't losing Judaism, I was gaining Christianity. And of course, because of my involvement and reading about Eastern religions and so forth, I continue to see all of the religions as, in their different ways, pointing to this deeper spiritual truth. And of course, that's part of why I was attracted to the Theology Without Walls project that you head. And that's how I see myself now. It's not, I have my own version of Christianity, I guess.
Yes.
That is compatible in many ways with Judaism and with certain ways of reading Buddhism and certain ways of reading Hinduism.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I want to thank you very much. This has been fascinating, Richard, and fascinating because it's a real experience that you're reporting of someone always searching and thinking about it as the thinking adds this articulate level, so you can share it and what you're going through. And it's wonderful that you came out in a place of peace.
Yeah.
Yeah. So until next time.
Thank you, Jerry. It's been good to express it, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, that's
thanks.
great. That's great.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com, and always at GodandAutobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@GodandAutobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.